"I would rather marry my horse," the Earl of Greyhaven declared, his voice dripping with contempt. Yet 12 years later, she was the only one he begged to see, before death claimed him. The words had shattered her world in an instant. One moment, Amy Morris stood before the most powerful man in 3 counties, her heart laid bare. The next, she was nothing less than nothing. A woman of no consequence, as he so coldly put it, publicly humiliated before the cream of Victorian society. But now, the Earl of Greyhaven was dying, and in his final days, racked with fever and haunted by regrets, he'd sent for her, only her, not his titled relatives, not his sophisticated friends, not the society beauties who'd competed for his attention. Just Amy, the village teacher he'd destroyed with 7 brutal words. What could he possibly want? Forgiveness? Understanding? Or was this one final cruelty from a man who'd made an art of breaking hearts? Amy Morris was about to discover that some truths are more devastating than any rejection, and that the Earl of Greyhaven had been hiding a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about that terrible night. Hello, my dear. If this tale of heartbreak and hidden truths speaks to you, I'd be ever so grateful for your like or subscription. It truly helps me bring you more stories of love, loss, and the courage to face our past. Do tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I treasure every note, and each one brings such warmth to my heart. Spring, 1848, Greyhaven Hall. Amy Morris stood outside the Earl's study, one gloved hand hovering just inches from the polished brass handle. Through the crack in the door, she could see the warm glow of candlelight dancing across leather-bound books and dark mahogany paneling. Somewhere in the depths of Greyhaven Hall, an orchestra played a waltz for the spring assembly, the event of the season. Ladies in silk and gentlemen in evening dress would be swirling across the ballroom floor, champagne flowing, gossip flourishing like hothouse roses. But Amy stood alone in this dim corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might break through the borrowed fabric of her gown. At 20 years old, she was acutely aware that this moment would define the rest of her life. Everything, her future, her father's dwindling hope, her very survival, in a society that had already half abandoned her, hinged on what happened beyond that door. She pressed her palm against the cool brass, and the touch sent her spiraling backward through memory. 1 year earlier, spring, 1847, the Northern Cross Railway inauguration had been her father's triumph. Jonathan Morris, self-made magnate and engineering visionary, stood on the platform before the gleaming new locomotive, his chest swelling with justifiable pride. He'd built an empire from nothing, a blacksmith's son who'd transformed himself through sheer brilliance and relentless work into one of England's foremost railway developers. 19-year-old Amy had stood beside him in a gown of emerald silk, her dark hair swept up in the latest fashion, utterly confident in her place in the world. Her mother, daughter of a baronet, had given Amy just enough aristocratic blood to be received in drawing rooms, while her father's fortune and progressive beliefs had given her something far more precious, an education that extended beyond needlework and French. She could discuss steam pressure ratios. She understood track gauge standards. She'd read Brunel's engineering papers and could debate the merits of different bridge designs, which was precisely why, when Alexander Ashford, Earl of Greyhaven, approached her father during the reception, she hadn't demurely retreated to stand with the other ladies. "Impressive work, Morris," the Earl had said, his steel-grey eyes assessing the locomotive with the keen interest of a man who understood business. "The pressure valve design is particularly clever." "My daughter's suggestion, actually," her father had replied with obvious pride. "Amy has quite the head for engineering." Those grey eyes had turned to her then, and Amy had felt the full weight of his attention. Alexander Ashford was 28, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and aristocratic features that might have been carved from marble. But it was his gaze that captured her, intelligent, penetrating, entirely without the dismissive condescension most men showed when they looked at young women. "Is that so?" His voice carried genuine interest. "What made you consider the valve placement?" And Amy, who'd spent countless evenings studying her father's designs, had answered with confidence. They'd spoken for 20 minutes about steam pressure, safety mechanisms, and the future of rail transport. She'd watched something flicker in those grey eyes, respect, perhaps, or intrigue. Over the following months, They'd encountered each other at various events. Each conversation left Amy more captivated. Alexander was different from other aristocrats. He worked, he created, he believed in progress. He spoke to her as an equal, discussing innovations and ideas rather than weather and gossip. She'd been foolish enough to interpret his intellectual respect as romantic interest. Then came the catastrophe that changed everything. The Northern Cross Railway Bridge had collapsed on a grey October morning. 17 workers died when the supports gave way, sending them plummeting into the river below. The subsequent investigation should have revealed the truth that rival companies had bribed inspectors, that saboteurs had deliberately weakened the structure, but the saboteurs had covered their tracks with the thoroughness of men who'd planned their crime carefully. Society didn't need proof. They needed a scapegoat. Jonathan Morris, the upstart industrialist who dared to compete with old money, was ruined. Investors fled like rats from a sinking ship. Creditors seized everything: Morris House with its marble staircase and crystal chandeliers, the London townhouse, even her mother's jewelry. Within 6 months, Amy's world had contracted from ballrooms and servants to a cramped cottage provided by pitying relatives. Her mother had died that winter, felled by a fever that Amy knew was really heartbreak and shame wearing medical disguise. And through it all, Alexander Ashford had been the only investor who hadn't publicly condemned her father, the only one who hadn't demanded immediate repayment, the only one whose name hadn't appeared among the ranks of accusers. Present moment. Spring 1848. The memory released her, snapping her back to the corridor outside his study. That was why she'd come tonight, because the invitation to Greyhaven Hall's spring assembly had seemed like a gesture of support, a lifeline extended to a drowning woman. Amy smoothed the dove-grey silk of her borrowed gown, so much plainer than the emerald creation she'd worn a year ago, and forced her breathing to steady. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in the cramped cottage where she and her father now existed on charity. The words always came easily in imagination, poised, articulate, expressing gratitude for his continued faith, perhaps mentioning the evidence her father was gathering to prove sabotage. Maybe, if she found the courage, a subtle indication of her own feelings. She believed their intellectual connection had meant something. She had to believe it, because if it meant nothing, then she had nothing left at all. Amy took one final breath and pushed open the door. The study was exactly as she'd imagined, all leather and mahogany and the smell of good brandy. Alexander sat at his desk, candlelight casting shadows across features that seemed harder than she remembered, more remote. He looked up at the sound of the door, and for one heartbeat, something flickered in those grey eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by aristocratic neutrality. "Miss Morris," he said, his voice measured and revealing nothing. "This is unexpected." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded, to Amy's ears, like the sealing of fate itself. Alexander set down his pen with deliberate precision, his steel-grey eyes fixed on her face. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation. Amy had planned this moment so carefully: the graceful entrance, the poised speech, the subtle indication of her feelings wrapped in layers of propriety. Instead, standing before him in her borrowed gown, with candlelight throwing shadows across his aristocratic features, all her carefully constructed words crumbled like ash. "My lord, her voice caught. She pressed her gloved hands together, willing them to stop trembling. "Forgive the intrusion. I know this is irregular, but I must speak plainly." One dark brow rose slightly. "Plain speech is a rare commodity in society, Miss Morris. I confess myself curious." The word should have encouraged her. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, about to step into empty air. "These past months have been the darkest of my life," she began, the words rushing out now, raw and unpolished. "My father's ruin, my mother's death, the loss of everything we held dear. Society has turned its back on us, and I understand why. In their eyes, we're tainted by scandal, unworthy of the regard we once commanded." She took a step forward, her hands clutching at her skirts. "But you, Lord Greyhaven, you were different. When others condemned my father without trial, you remained silent. When others demanded immediate repayment, you extended patience. I interpreted this as kindness, as faith that the truth would eventually emerge." Alexander's expression remained neutral, but something in his stillness felt dangerous, like the moment before a storm breaks. "More than that," Amy continued, unable to stop now that she'd begun. Our conversations this past year about engineering, about progress, about ideas they've been a light in the darkness. You spoke to me as though my thoughts mattered, as though my mind held value beyond my father's fortune or my mother's bloodline. Her voice dropped lower, more intimate. I know I have nothing to offer you now. No dowry, no connections, no position in society. I know my family's disgrace has tainted me by association, but my affection for you is genuine, Lord Greyhaven, and I dared to hope foolishly, perhaps that you might see past my reduced circumstances to the woman beneath. That our intellectual connection might mean— Stop. The word was quiet but carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Amy's breath caught in her throat. Alexander stood slowly, his face transforming before her eyes. The slight warmth she'd imagined there, had she imagined it, evaporated, like morning mist. What remained was cold, harder than the marble statues in his entrance hall, and infinitely more cruel. "Miss Morris," he said, his tone carrying that particular aristocratic drawl that made every syllable a weapon, "I fear you have gravely misunderstood the nature of our acquaintance." He moved around the desk with the predatory grace of a man entirely certain of his power. "I conversed with you as I would with any reasonably intelligent person. Indeed, I discuss locomotive engineering with my head groom as well. He has quite the knack for mechanical systems." It signified nothing beyond polite interest in a mutual investment venture. The words struck like physical blows. Amy felt the blood drain from her face. "Your current circumstances," Alexander continued, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage, make this appeal even more inappropriate. "You come to me essentially begging, offering yourself like—" He paused, his lip curling with distaste. "I require neither charity cases nor desperate women throwing themselves at my title." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath, see the absolute coldness in those grey eyes that had once seemed so warm with respect. "Indeed, Miss Morris, I would rather marry my horse, Tempest, than bind myself to a woman of such diminished circumstances and embarrassing forwardness." His voice dropped lower, more intimate, somehow more devastating for it. "At least Tempest has proper bloodlines and doesn't presume above her station." The cruelty was surgical, precise, designed to destroy not just hope, but dignity itself. Amy swayed, one hand reaching blindly for the desk's edge to steady herself. The room tilted. She felt as though all the air had been sucked from the study, from her lungs, from the world. Her face, she knew without seeing, must have drained of all color. "My lord, Whatever she might have said was obliterated by a sharp, theatrical gasp from behind her. Amy spun, her borrowed skirts tangling around her legs. The study door stood wide open. How long had it been open? How much had been heard? Lady Penelope Hartwick, the Earl's widowed half-sister and Greyhaven Hall's hostess, stood framed in the doorway, one hand pressed to her ample bosom in a gesture of scandalized shock. Her face displayed perfect horror, but her eyes glittered with something that looked suspiciously like triumph. Behind her stood three society matrons, Mrs. Chadwick, Lady Ashworth, and the formidable Duchess of Thornbury herself. Their expressions ranged from shock to barely concealed delight, the look of women who'd just stumbled upon the social scandal of the season. "Oh my," Lady Penelope breathed, her voice carrying with perfect clarity. "Oh my dear. We were just that as we heard voices and thought perhaps someone was unwell." The lie was transparent. "Poor Miss Morris. You look quite pale. Should we perhaps summon a physician?" The false concern was more poisonous than open mockery would have been. Everyone in that doorway knew exactly what they'd witnessed. Everyone understood what they'd heard. And by morning, everyone in 3 counties would know it too. Amy looked back at Alexander, some desperate part of her hoping he might say something, might soften the blow somehow. His face had gone rigid, a muscle jumping in his jaw. But he said nothing, offered nothing, simply stood there in silence as her world crumbled around her. She forced herself to move, to curtsy with whatever dignity she could salvage. "Forgive the intrusion, my lord. I see now that I misunderstood. I shan't trouble you again." The words came out steadier than she'd expected, though her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them behind her back. She walked toward the door, toward the watching women, toward her own social execution. Lady Penelope stepped aside with exaggerated solicitude, her eyes never leaving Amy's face. Then Amy was through the door, into the corridor, and suddenly the path to the entrance hall stretched before her like a gauntlet. The ballroom doors stood open, music still played, and as she walked she would not run, would not give them that satisfaction. She felt every eye turn toward her. Whispers rose like a wave in her wake. "Did you hear?" Compared her to his horse, throwing herself at him. "Can you imagine?" Desperate creatures. Faces turned, fans snapped open, lips curled with malicious satisfaction. She saw it all through a strange fog, as though she were watching herself from a great distance. This is what drowning feels like, she thought. This is what it means to die while still breathing. By the time she reached the front door, by the time the night air hit her face, she knew with absolute certainty her life, as she had known it, was over. The morning sun, streaming through the cottage's thin curtains, felt like an accusation. Amy sat at the small wooden table in the cramped parlor, still wearing last night's borrowed gown, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. She'd been sitting there since returning near midnight, too numb to cry, too shocked to move. Her aunt, her mother's elderly sister who'd grudgingly taken them in, hovered in the doorway, opening her mouth to speak, then closing it again. What could she possibly say? Finally, she retreated to the kitchen with a rustle of black bombazine, leaving only awkward silence. The knock came at 9:30. The newsboy, cheerful and oblivious, handed over the morning papers with a gap-toothed grin. Amy's hands shook as she unfolded the society pages. She didn't have to search long. A certain impoverished young miss made quite the spectacle at a recent assembly, declaring her affections to a certain Earl of distinguished lineage. The gentleman's response comparing matrimony to the lady unfavorably with equine companionship has set tongues wagging from Mayfair to Manchester. One can only pity such desperate measures, though society must draw its lines somewhere, mustn't it? The words blurred. Another paper was even more explicit, quoting the horse comparison directly, serving up her humiliation as morning entertainment for thousands of breakfast tables across England. By noon, 3 calling cards that had been left earlier in the week were quietly retrieved by embarrassed servants. By tea time, her aunt received a note from the vicar's wife. "Terribly sorry, but perhaps Miss Morris might be more comfortable worshipping in another parish? Given the unfortunate circumstances, one must think of the other parishioners. After all, the systematic destruction was swift and thorough." Mrs. Whitmore, who'd been her mother's friend, crossed the street rather than acknowledge Amy during a visit to the village shops. The charitable ladies who'd previously included her in their basket-making for the poor sent word through servants that her assistance was no longer required. Former friends who'd promised eternal loyalty after her father's ruin now discovered pressing engagements whenever Amy appeared. Even the lending library refused to renew her subscription. "Given the circumstances," the clerk had mumbled, not meeting her eyes, "management feels it best." Victorian society's mechanisms of ostracism moved with the precision of clockwork and the mercy of a guillotine. One day you were received, if marginally. The next, you were invisible. But worse than her own destruction was watching what it did to her father. Jonathan Morris had survived financial ruin with grim determination, believing that truth would eventually vindicate him, that evidence of sabotage would emerge, that his reputation could be rebuilt. He'd clung to hope like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Amy's scandal shattered that hope completely. He stopped eating first. "Not hungry," he'd murmur, pushing away the simple meals Amy prepared. Then he stopped speaking, sitting for hours by the window, staring at nothing. The fire behind his eyes, that brilliant, restless intelligence that had built a railway empire, guttered and died. The doctor, summoned when her father collapsed one grey November morning, examined him with professional detachment. "There's no physical ailment I can identify," he told Amy quietly in the hallway. "Sometimes, Miss Morris, the spirit simply breaks. The body follows where the heart leads." 6 months after that terrible night at Greyhaven Hall, Jonathan Morris died in his sleep. The doctor wrote, "heart failure," on the death certificate. But Amy knew the truth. Society had killed him as surely as if they'd put a blade through his chest. First his business, then his wife. Now his daughter's disgrace, it was more than any man could bear. The funeral was held on a cold February morning, with freezing rain turning the churchyard to mud. Amy stood alone at the graveside, a pauper's grave, since even the modest family plot had been sold to creditors. No mourners attended. No former friends or business associates paid their respects. Just Amy in her worn black dress, the vicar rushing through prayers, and two labourers waiting to fill in the earth. She watched them lower the plain wooden coffin and felt something inside her crack. Not break, she was done breaking. This was different. This was the moment when the girl she'd been died and something harder took her place. That evening, she counted out her remaining shillings on the cottage table. Barely enough for coach fare north. Her aunt made it clear that continued residence was no longer possible. "I've done my duty to your dear mother's memory. But really, Amy, the scandal." Amy packed a single small trunk, 2 dresses, a few books, her mother's cameo brooch, the miniature portrait of her parents taken in happier days. Everything else, the life she'd known, the person she'd been stayed behind like shed skin. The coach to Lancashire departed at dawn. Amy climbed aboard among merchants and clerks and farmers' wives, people who'd never heard of the Earl of Greyhaven or cared about southern scandals. She took her seat, placed her trunk at her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. As the coach lurched into motion, she allowed herself one final look back. In the distance, visible on its hill, Greyhaven Hall stood like a monument to cruelty, grey stone and cold windows, remote and untouchable. Amy turned forward in her seat, facing north toward an uncertain future in a place she'd never seen. Behind her lay everything she'd lost: her family, her home, her name, her hope of love. Ahead lay only the unknown. But anything, she thought as the familiar landscape began to fade, anything was better than remaining in this graveyard of her former life. She was 20 years old, alone in the world, with barely enough money to survive a month. But she was leaving, and that was enough. For now, it had to be enough. The village of Milbrook clung to the Lancashire hills like lichen to stone-grey cottages, grey skies, grey moors stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It was as far from Greyhaven's manicured gardens and marble halls as England could offer, and that was precisely why Amy had chosen it. She arrived on a March morning in 1848 with her single trunk, her dwindling coins, and a letter of introduction from a distant cousin who'd known someone who'd heard that Milbrook's small school needed help. Mrs. Fletcher, the widow who ran the school, met her at the coaching inn. She was a sturdy woman of 50, with work-roughened hands and shrewd eyes that assessed Amy in one sweeping glance. "You're educated, then?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. Mathematics, literature, natural philosophy. My father believed in—" Amy's voice caught. "Believed in education for women." Mrs. Fletcher nodded slowly. "Can you teach reading and sums to farmers' daughters?" "Yes. Room and board in exchange for teaching. No salary, I can't afford it. But you'll have a roof and meals, and folks here are decent enough if you work hard." It was more than Amy had dared hope for. "I accept." "Good. And Miss Morris?" "Mrs." Fletcher's voice softened slightly. "Whatever you're running from, it won't follow you here. Nobody in Milbrook cares about southern scandals or society gossip. Work hard, keep your head down, and you'll be left in peace." It was the greatest mercy anyone had shown her in months. The school was a single-room stone building with rough wooden benches, a pot-bellied stove, and 8 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Farmers' daughters, shopkeepers' girls, children whose families believed education might offer them something better than endless drudgery. Young Lucy struggled terribly with her letters. At 7 years old, she would spend an hour on a single word, her tongue caught between her teeth in fierce concentration, tears of frustration welling when the letters refused to make sense. But she never gave up. That determination, Amy learned to recognize, was worth more than easy brilliance. Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, had a gift for numbers that astounded Amy. At 12, she could calculate complex sums in her head, understood algebraic principles that most boys twice her age would never grasp. In another life, with different circumstances, Sarah could have attended university. Here, she would likely marry young and spend her brilliance managing household accounts. The twin sisters, Emma and Grace, finished each other's sentences with uncanny precision, their bond so close they seemed to share thoughts. They were middling students but brought warmth to the classroom, always ready with kindness for younger girls who struggled. Amy threw herself into teaching with desperate focus. She rose before dawn to prepare lessons, stayed up by candlelight grading slates. She learned to tend the temperamental stove, to stretch meager supplies, to make each precious book last through multiple students. But teaching alone couldn't fill all the empty hours. She began sitting with sick villagers, bringing tisanes and poultices, reading to the elderly, writing letters for those who couldn't manage their own correspondence. Mrs. Thompson at the bakery taught her herbal remedies for common ailments. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, consulted her on matters requiring someone literate and impartial. Slowly, painfully, Amy Morris rebuilt herself, not as the railway heiress who'd once worn emerald silk and discussed engineering with earls, as someone simpler, someone useful. Miss Morris, the teacher. The years passed with the quiet rhythm of rural life. Seasons turned, students grew and married, and brought their own daughters to learn. Amy's face lost its haunted thinness, though her eyes never quite lost their wariness. 2 men proposed marriage. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, kind but dull, offered respectability and modest comfort. She declined gently. Dr. Whitmore, passing through on his way to a practice in Manchester, offered affection and adventure. She declined that too. "Don't you want companionship?" Mrs. Fletcher asked after the second refusal. Amy considered the question honestly. "I did once. I wanted it so desperately I made a fool of myself. I learned that needing someone gives them power to destroy you." She met Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. "I won't give anyone that power again. I have purpose here. That's enough." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't what she dreamed at 19, but it was real, and it was hers, and no one could take it from her. By spring of 1860, Amy was 32 years old. The morning had been spent on grammar lessons and arithmetic drills. Sarah had mastered quadratic equations. Amy would need to find more advanced texts somehow. Lucy had finally, triumphantly, read an entire page without help. The twins had presented a wildflower they'd picked for her desk. Amy's room under Mrs. Fletcher's eaves was small but sufficient. A narrow bed, a washstand, a shelf of precious books, a writing desk beneath the window, overlooking Milbrook's single street. That evening, she sat with her tea and Wordsworth, planning tomorrow's history lesson, feeling something that approximated contentment. She'd built a life from ruins, not a grand life, but a meaningful one. She had students who needed her, a village that valued her, work that mattered. The girl who'd stood in Alexander Ashford's study seemed like someone from another lifetime. She was safe here. She was whole. She had found, against all odds, peace. The knock on her door came just as twilight deepened to darkness. Mrs. Fletcher stood in the hallway, her face troubled. In her hands, she held a black-bordered envelope, mourning stationery. The seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable. A grey hawk in flight. Greyhaven's seal. "This came by special courier, dear," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. "From Greyhaven Hall." 12 years collapsed to nothing. Amy's hands began to shake. The teacup rattled in its saucer. That seal, that house, that man. The past she'd buried so carefully had just clawed its way back from the grave. Amy sat frozen, staring at the envelope as though it were a serpent coiled on her writing desk. The grey hawk seal seemed to watch her with predatory patience. Mrs. Fletcher had withdrawn after setting down fresh tea, understanding instinctively that some moments required solitude. An hour passed. The tea grew cold. Outside her window, Milbrook settled into its evening rhythms, the lamplighter making his rounds, mothers calling children in for supper, the blacksmith's hammer finally falling silent. Normal life continuing, while Amy's carefully constructed peace crumbled at the edges. She didn't want to open it. Opening it meant letting the past back in, meant allowing Alexander Ashford's voice into the sanctuary she'd built from the wreckage he'd created. For 12 years, she'd kept him buried, not forgotten, never forgotten, but contained, sealed away like something toxic that could poison her if released. But the black border proclaimed mourning. Someone had died, and he'd written to her, after 12 years of silence. Memories flooded back despite her resistance. The study at Greyhaven Hall, candlelight and mahogany, and the smell of brandy. His cold grey eyes as he compared her to livestock. The gasps from the doorway, walking through the assembly while whispers rose like a tide. Her father's face when he heard, the light dying in his eyes. The pauper's grave in freezing rain. Everything she'd buried so carefully resurfaces in a rush of bile and old grief. Her hands trembled violently as she finally broke the seal. A bank draft fluttered out. She barely glanced at it. The letter was written in a hand that shook with illness, the once confident script now wavering and uncertain. "Miss Morris, I am dying. Consumption. the physicians say, though the specific diagnosis matters little. Weeks, perhaps days, remain. I do not write seeking forgiveness. I have no right to your mercy. I do not write to apologize, though God knows I should. Words cannot mend what I shattered. I write because I find myself unable to face death without seeing you once more. You were the only person who ever saw me, truly saw me, and offered something genuine. You were wrong about me, of course. I was never worthy of what you offered. But the memory of your mistaken faith has haunted me for 12 years. There are things you don't know about that night, things I've never told anyone. I am too much a coward to die with them unspoken, and too selfish to carry them into whatever awaits me. Come or don't. I have no claim on your time or compassion, but know that if you don't come, you will be my final regret in a life crowded with them. I have enclosed funds for your journey and compensation for your time. This is not payment for your presence. No sum could purchase that. Consider it restitution for damages long overdue. Alexander Ashford, Earl of Greyhaven. P.S. I married briefly. Lady Catherine Thornbury. She died 6 years ago in childbirth, along with the babe. My cousin inherits. I mention this so you understand. I am not asking you to be the Countess of Greyhaven. I am asking you to be Amy, one last time. She read it 3 times, searching for mockery, for cruelty disguised as contrition, for some trap hidden in the carefully chosen words. She found none, only exhaustion, regret, and a raw honesty that was somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been. The bank draft lay on her desk, £50 more money than she'd seen in 12 years. A fortune to someone living on room and board. Not payment for her presence, he claimed. Restitution for damages long overdue, as if any sum could repay what he'd taken from her. Mrs. Fletcher knocked softly and entered with fresh tea. She said nothing, simply placed the cup on the desk and waited. He's dying, Amy said finally, her voice strange to her own ears. The Earl of Greyhaven, the man who... She couldn't finish the sentence. I know, dear. Mrs. Fletcher's voice was gentle. The courier was quite talkative with the innkeeper. He wants me to come, to see him before... Amy's throat closed. He says there are things I don't know, things about that night. Will you go? I shouldn't. I have my students. I have my life here. I've built peace from ruins, and going back risks all of it. Amy pressed her fingers to her temples. I should burn this letter and forget I ever received it. But you won't. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Fletcher knew her too well. I can't, Amy whispered. God help me. I can't. Because if I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what he wanted to tell me, what secrets he kept, what truth might finally explain why he destroyed me so thoroughly. Sometimes, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, we have to go back before we can truly move forward. Face the ghost before it stops haunting us. The next morning, Amy spoke to her students. Lucy cried and clung to her skirts. Sarah asked serious questions about when she'd return. The twins made her promise, truly promise, that she was coming back. This is my home, Amy told them, gathering all 8 girls close. You are my family. Nothing will change that. I must settle an old matter, but I will return. You have my word. Mr. Davies, the solicitor who'd once proposed marriage, agreed readily to cover her classes. Take what time you need, Miss Morris. We'll manage. That evening, Amy packed her small trunk, the same trunk she'd brought to Milbrook 12 years ago. 2 practical dresses, her mother's cameo, a few books. She added the bank draft, folded carefully. Whatever Alexander's intentions, she would use his money for the school, for books, slates, perhaps a globe for teaching geography. Let his guilt at least educate the children he'd never met. As twilight gathered, Amy stood at her window, looking out over Milbrook's grey stone cottages and moor-stretched horizon. This village had saved her. These people had given her purpose when she had nothing. She was respected here, valued, safe, but she wasn't free. Not yet. Some ghost from 12 years ago still had its claws in her, and she couldn't move forward until she faced it. I'll leave tomorrow, she told Mrs. Fletcher over supper. The older woman nodded, unsurprised. You're stronger than you were, Amy. Remember that. You're not the desperate girl who fled north. You're a woman who built a life from nothing. He can't destroy what you've become. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Amy stared at the ceiling and acknowledged the truth. 12 years ago, she'd fled Greyhaven broken and humiliated, with nothing but a trunk and shattered dignity. She was returning whole, on her own terms, to face the man who'd destroyed her. This time, she held all the power. And that made all the difference. The journey south took 2 days by coach, 2 days of watching the landscape transform from Lancashire's grey moors to gentler southern counties with their manicured estates and ancient hedgerows. With each mile, the scenery grew more familiar, triggering memories Amy had spent 12 years trying to bury. She shared the coach with a merchant's wife travelling to Bath and a young clergyman bound for a new parish. They made polite conversation, asked about her journey. She told them she was visiting family, a half-truth that required no elaboration. They couldn't know that she was travelling toward the man who'd destroyed her, toward a reckoning 12 years in the making. Amy studied her reflection in the coach window. She was 32 now, not 20. Her face had lost its youthful softness, replaced by something firmer, more defined. Fine lines bracketed her mouth, earned through years of teaching, comforting sick children, managing on too little sleep, and even less money. Her hands, once soft and pampered, now bore the calluses of work. She'd survived, built a life from ruins, become someone who mattered in small, meaningful ways. The girl who'd stood in Alexander's study offering her heart so desperately, that girl was dead. Amy had mourned her and moved on. Now she was returning as someone different, someone harder, someone who couldn't be broken again because she'd already been shattered and had learned to live with the cracks. Fear still coiled in her stomach as the coach passed familiar landmarks: the old mill, the stone bridge over the river, the ancient oak that marked the boundary of Greyhaven's lands. But it was manageable fear now. The fear of facing a difficult task, not the terror of annihilation. She could do this. She would do this. The coach turned up the long drive to Greyhaven Hall as afternoon shadows lengthened across the grounds. Amy's breath caught. The estate had decayed. Gardens that had once been immaculate now sprawled wild and overgrown. Roses climbed unchecked over trellises, their blooms ragged and unpruned. Ivy claimed the eastern wall, dark tendrils creeping across weathered stone. Several upper windows were shuttered, their paint peeling in long grey strips. The gravel drive was pocked, with weeds pushing through from below. The house itself seemed diminished, as though it were slowly collapsing inward. Like it's dying with its master, Amy thought, and felt a strange pang that wasn't quite pity but something close. An elderly butler appeared on the steps as the coach halted. His livery was impeccable despite the general air of neglect. As Amy descended, his eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Morris." His voice held genuine shock. "Can it truly be, after all these years?" "It is I, Mr. Henshaw." She'd forgotten his name until this moment, pulled from some dusty corner of memory. "The Earl sent for me." Yes, he did." Relief flooded the old man's face. "Daily, he asks, hourly, toward the end. Has Miss Morris come? Has there been word? Thank God you've arrived." A woman emerged from the entrance hall, stern-faced, perhaps 50, in the black bombazine of a housekeeper. Her sharp eyes assessed Amy with the thoroughness of one accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Miss Morris, I'm Mrs. Brennan, housekeeper. Welcome to Greyhaven Hall." Her tone was professional, revealing nothing. "Please, come inside." The entrance hall struck Amy like a physical blow. It was cold, bitterly cold, despite the spring warmth outside. The air smelled of camphor and beeswax, and something underneath, the sweet, sickly scent of death approaching. White dust covers draped the furniture like shrouds. The mirrors had been turned to face the walls, a mark of deep mourning, though Alexander still lived. This was a house that had already surrendered. Mrs. Brennan led her to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit. "I feel I should explain the situation before you see him, Miss Morris. His lordship has been ill for 6 months. Consumption, the physicians say. He's been bedridden for 2 months now." She folded her hands precisely. "Some days he's lucid and can converse almost normally. Other days, the fever takes him, and he barely knows where he is. He refuses most visitors, his cousin, old friends, even his sister. Speaks rarely except to ask one question, over and over." Her voice softened slightly. "Has Miss Morris come? Has there been word?" "Mrs." Brennan's shrewd gaze pinned Amy. "I don't know what passed between you 12 years ago, miss. It's not my place to know. But I must warn you, he's not the man you knew. The illness has reduced him. It's not pleasant to see. Amy met her eyes steadily. He reduced me once, Mrs. Brennan. Quite thoroughly. Perhaps we'll finally be equals. Something flickered across the housekeeper's face, approval perhaps, or recognition of steel beneath politeness. Perhaps so, miss. Perhaps so. She was given a guest room on the second floor, far from the master's chambers. It was well appointed but cold, the fireplace unlit to save coal. Amy stood at the window, looking out over the overgrown gardens. From here, she could see the conservatory where she'd found Alexander that terrible night. The glass panes were clouded now with dirt and neglect, the exotic plants inside surely dead, a monument to decay. She remembered walking through those doors with her heart hammering, her carefully rehearsed speech crumbling into raw confession. She remembered the exact moment his expression had turned to ice, the precise tone of his voice when he'd compared her to his horse. 12 years, and the memory could still make her hands shake. But she wasn't that desperate girl anymore. She'd built a life without him, survived without him, become whole without him. Whatever he had to say now, whatever secrets he'd kept, they couldn't destroy her. She wouldn't let them. A knock at the door. Mrs. Brennan stood in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. He's awake, miss, and lucid for the moment. He's asking for you. This was it, the moment she'd traveled 2 days to face. Amy stood, smoothed her plain grey travelling dress, and lifted her chin. 12 years ago, she'd walked into Alexander Ashford's study with hope and desperation, offering her heart like a beggar offering empty hands. Now she walked with something far more powerful, the knowledge that she'd survived him, that she was whole despite him, that he could never destroy her again because she'd already been destroyed and had rebuilt herself stronger. "Take me to him," Amy said. Her voice didn't shake at all. Mrs. Brennan led her through corridors that grew progressively dimmer, as though the house itself were withdrawing from light. They stopped before a heavy oak door at the east wing's end. The housekeeper knocked softly, then pushed it open. "Miss Morris is here, my lord." She stepped aside, and Amy entered alone. The chamber was oppressively dim, heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. What little light filtered through cast everything in shades of grey and amber. The air was thick with the smell of camphor, laudanum, and something sweeter and more terrible, the scent of a body slowly surrendering to death. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the room, and in it, propped against pillows, lay what remained of Alexander Ashford. Amy's breath caught despite her preparation. He was skeletal. There was no kinder word for it. His cheeks were hollow, skin stretched tight over prominent bones that seemed on the verge of breaking through. His hands, resting on the coverlet, were all sharp angles and blue-traced veins. The broad shoulders, she remembered, had vanished, leaving only a wasted frame beneath his nightshirt. His hair, once so dark, was streaked with grey and lay limp against the pillow. But his eyes, those steel-grey eyes that had first captivated her at a railway inauguration 13 years ago, still burned with fevered life. Too large now in his gaunt face, they fixed on her with desperate intensity. For a long moment, neither spoke. Amy stood just inside the door, her hands clasped before her, while Alexander stared as though she might vanish if he blinked. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "You came." Amy forced steel into her spine. "Don't make more of this than it is. I came because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't, not because you deserve my presence." A sound escaped him, a laugh that immediately transformed into a racking cough. The spasm bent him forward, shaking his thin frame. Amy's instinct screamed at her to move, to help, to offer water or support. She forced herself to remain still, watching with the detachment of a stranger observing another's suffering. When the fit passed, Alexander collapsed back against his pillows, gasping. His eyes were wet from coughing. Surely, though perhaps something else gleamed there too. "No," he managed when he could speak again. "I don't deserve it. I didn't deserve it then. I certainly don't deserve it now." He gestured weakly toward a chair beside the bed. "Will you sit? Or will you make me beg? I find I have very little pride left to spend." Amy considered remaining standing a power position, maintaining control, but petty dominance felt beneath her. She sat, but pulled the chair back several inches, maintaining clear distance between them, a space he could not cross without her permission. Alexander noticed. Despite his weakness, despite everything, a faint smile touched his lips. "Still keeping your distance?" Wise. I learned caution from you, Amy replied. Among other things. Silence fell, awkward and heavy. Beyond the heavy curtains, she could hear birds calling in the overgrown gardens. Life continuing its relentless march, while death waited patiently in this dim chamber. Alexander broke the silence first. Tell me about Milbrook. Your letter mentioned teaching. Tell me about your students, your life there. Amy hesitated, reluctant to share anything of her carefully rebuilt world with the man who'd shattered the first one. But perhaps that was the point, to show him what she'd become despite him. I teach 8 girls, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Farmers' daughters mostly. Reading, arithmetic, some history and natural philosophy. They'll never attend university or marry lords, but they'll be able to manage household accounts, read to their children, perhaps teach in turn. You found purpose, Alexander murmured, his eyes never leaving her face. Real purpose. Not the empty charitable works of society, ladies, but something that matters. Yes, Amy's voice cooled. I built it from the ruins you left me with. I know. His acknowledgement was simple, devastating. I'm glad you survived. Gladder still that you flourished. You deserved better than what I gave you. The silence stretched again, heavy with 12 years of accumulated hurt. Alexander struggled to find words, his breath coming in short gasps. Amy waited, offering nothing, determined not to make this easier for him. Finally he spoke again. There are things you don't know about that night, things I've never told anyone. What could possibly justify what you did? The words came out sharper than Amy intended. Nothing. Alexander's voice was firm despite its weakness. Nothing justifies it, but you deserve to understand it. You deserve to know why I chose cruelty over... He broke off, coughing again, this time more violently. A nurse appeared from an adjoining room. Amy hadn't realized anyone else was present. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, holding a glass of water mixed with what was likely laudanum to Alexander's lips. He drank with obvious reluctance, the effort exhausting him. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway. Perhaps Miss Morris should rest, my lord. You've overtaxed yourself. No, Alexander tried to protest, but another coughing fit cut him off. Tomorrow, Mrs. Brennan said firmly. To Amy, he'll be stronger in the morning, if God wills it. Amy stood, grateful for the reprieve. Seeing him like this, broken, dying, stripped of all the power and pride that had once seemed infinite, was more difficult than she'd anticipated. You'll come back? Alexander's voice was desperate now, all pretense abandoned. Tomorrow, please? Amy paused at the door. Some part of her wanted to refuse, to let him die wondering, to deny him even this small comfort. But she'd come for answers, and she would stay until she had them. If you're still alive, she said. His faint smile held something that might have been approval. Fair enough. Amy returned to her guest room, closed the door, and leaned against it. Her hands were trembling now, all the composure she'd maintained in his presence dissolving in private. She'd expected to feel triumphant, seeing him reduced, powerless, dying. She'd imagined satisfaction, even vindication, at witnessing the Earl of Greyhaven brought low. Instead, she felt only a complicated sadness she couldn't yet name. He was dying. The man who'd destroyed her, who'd compared her to livestock, who'd humiliated her before society and indirectly killed her father, he was dying. And somehow, impossibly, she didn't feel the satisfaction she'd imagined for 12 years. Only a deep, weary sorrow for all the wasted years. His years, spent alone in this decaying mansion, guarded by walls he'd built himself. Her years, rebuilding from ruins, learning to trust again, finding purpose in the absence of love. So many years, so much damage, and for what? Amy moved to the window, looking out over the gardens where spring was attempting to assert itself despite the neglect. Wild roses bloomed among the weeds, life persisting even in decay. Tomorrow he would tell her his secrets. Tomorrow she would learn what truths he'd kept for 12 years. But tonight, she simply stood at the window and wondered whether understanding would heal the old wound or simply give her different pain to carry. Morning came grey and uncertain, spring rain pattering against the window panes. Amy had slept poorly, her dreams tangled with memories of the conservatory, of Alexander's cold eyes, of her father's grave. She woke feeling hollowed out, uncertain whether she had the strength for whatever revelations today would bring. Mrs. Brennan found her at breakfast. "He's awake, miss," and asking for you, but there's something else. He wants to go outside. To the gardens. In his condition? Amy set down her teacup. Surely that's madness, yes. Mrs. Brennan's expression was grim. I told him as much. The exertion alone could kill him, but he's insisting. Says he wants to see the gardens once more before. She didn't finish the sentence. In Alexander's chamber, Amy found him already dressed, if one could call it that. A heavy robe over his nightshirt, blankets ready to wrap around his legs. He looked even worse than yesterday, his face grey with exhaustion from merely sitting upright. Miss Morris. His voice was stronger today, more determined. I want to go outside. Mrs. Brennan objects, but you're dying anyway, Amy finished. You want to see the gardens once more? Yes. Relief flooded his gaunt face. Would you take me? She should refuse. Let him die in this dim chamber, without the comfort of sunlight and growing things. But looking at his desperate eyes, Amy found herself saying, I'll take him, Mrs. Brennan. It took 3 of them, Amy, Mrs. Brennan, and a young footman, to get Alexander from bed to the wheeled chair. The effort left him gasping, his face grey as ash. His body was so light, so insubstantial, it was like moving a bundle of kindling wrapped in cloth. By the time they'd settled him with blankets around his legs and a hat against the drizzle, he was shaking with exhaustion. Perhaps this isn't wise, Amy said, doubt creeping in. Alexander's faint smile held bitter amusement. Nothing I've done has been wise, Miss Morris. Why start now? The gardens were even more melancholy in the rain. What had once been magnificent, immaculate beds of roses and peonies, gravel walks edged with lavender, topiary shaped into fantastic creatures, now sprawled wild and overgrown. Roses climbed unchecked over trellises and walls, their blooms ragged. Weeds choked the flower beds. The gravel paths were barely visible beneath encroaching grass. Like me, Alexander murmured as Amy wheeled him along an overgrown path. I've let everything go to seed. They reached a stone bench overlooking the estate's lower grounds. Beyond the gardens, green fields stretched toward the village, where tenant cottages sent up thin spirals of smoke. Life continuing its ordinary business while death waited patiently in the manor above. Will you sit? Alexander asked. Not hovering behind the chair like a nurse, but beside me. Amy hesitated. They'd maintained careful distance yesterday, but they were outside now, in the open air, with the spring rain soft on her face. What harm could proximity do? She sat on the bench, leaving less space than before, close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands, close enough to smell the camphor and sickness that clung to him. I need to tell you about Lady Penelope, Alexander said abruptly. Your sister, Amy's voice was carefully neutral, the one who witnessed my humiliation, my half-sister, and the woman I loved, or thought I did. The words hung in the rain-soft air. Amy turned to look at him fully. Penelope wasn't my sister by blood, Alexander continued, his eyes fixed on the distant village. She was my father's second wife's daughter from her first marriage. We grew up together after my father remarried when I was 12. She was 10. He paused, gathering strength. We fell in love as teenagers, foolish, passionate, the way young people love before life teaches them caution. Society would have permitted the marriage we shared, no blood, only a household. But Penelope wanted more than I could offer. More than being a countess? Amy couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. She wanted a title through her own advantageous marriage, one where she held all the power. She married Baron Hartwick when she was 22. He was 70, with an ancient title and no heirs. She became a baroness through her own right, not through me. Alexander's hands tightened on the chair's arms. The Baron died 2 years later. Penelope returned to Greyhaven Hall to keep house for me, the widowed sister, caring for her bachelor brother. Society approved, and we resumed our affair, secretly. Amy felt something cold settle in her stomach. She wanted to be my countess, but on her terms, refused to remarry me unless I made her equal partner in the estate, gave her control over the finances, the lands, everything. I refused. I was bitter, you see, from her first rejection, bitter that she'd chosen an old man's title over me. So we remained in stalemate lovers in private, estranged in principle. He turned to look at Amy directly. Then you came to the spring assembly. The rain fell harder now, but neither moved. Penelope had been listening at the study door the entire time you were there, Alexander said, his voice dropping lower. She'd seen you arrive, suspected why you'd come. She orchestrated the accidental discovery, brought those society matrons deliberately. Why? The word came out strangled. Because she saw you as a genuine threat. I'd spoken of you, you see, with respect, with interest. Your mind, your education, the conversations we'd had about engineering. For the first time since her rejection, Penelope felt fear. Fear that I might actually love someone else. Alexander's breathing grew labored. She destroyed any possibility between us with surgical precision. By engineering your public humiliation, she ensured I could never pursue you without facing society's mockery. And my cruelty, his voice broke, my cruelty was performance. For her, to prove I felt nothing for you. Performance? Amy stood abruptly, trembling with emotion she couldn't name. Anger? Grief? Something more complicated than either. I believed, Alexander continued, speaking faster now as though afraid he'd run out of time, that if I accepted your love, if I showed any reciprocation, Penelope would destroy you more thoroughly than I ever could. She was capable of it, vicious in her jealousy. So I destroyed the hope quickly, made it impossible. I thought I was protecting you by pushing you away. Protecting me? Amy spun to face him, her voice shaking. You want absolution. You want me to say your cruelty was secretly kindness, that you were protecting me all along. She took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists. But you could have warned me. You could have been honest. Instead, you chose humiliation. You chose to make me believe I was worthless, that my feelings were pathetic, that I was less valuable than livestock. Her voice rose. That wasn't protection, Alexander. That was cowardice. You were afraid of Penelope, afraid of society, afraid of your own feelings, so you destroyed mine instead. Alexander didn't defend himself. He simply nodded, the movement costing him visible effort. You're right. I was a coward. I chose the easy cruelty over the hard truth. I made the worst possible choice and called it mercy. He tried to push himself more upright, but his strength failed. I've paid for it. Spent 12 years alone in this house, guarded by walls I built myself. Penelope stayed until she died 3 years ago, still bitter, still possessive, still punishing me for never fully surrendering. But you... His voice cracked. You paid more. You always pay more when men are cowards. His legs gave out. He collapsed back into the wheeled chair, gasping, his face grey as death. Amy moved instinctively to help, then stopped herself. Her hands hovered uselessly. Understanding warred with fury, pity with old rage. Take me inside, Alexander whispered. Please. Some truths, Amy realized, were too devastating to process in a single moment. Some revelations required time to settle, to transform from raw shock into something she could examine and understand. She gripped the handles of the wheeled chair and began pushing him back toward the house through the rain-soaked gardens, neither of them speaking, both knowing that everything had changed and nothing had changed. That truth didn't undo damage, only explained it. And sometimes, explanation was the cruelest gift of all. That evening, Amy sat alone in her guest room, staring at the rain-streaked window without seeing it. Alexander's revelations churned through her mind like a mill wheel, grinding truth from deception, understanding from ignorance. She believed him. That was the strange part, she believed every word. The story fit too perfectly with what she'd witnessed, explained too much to be fabrication. Penelope's malicious delight at the doorway, Alexander's performance of cruelty, the systematic destruction that followed. But belief didn't equal forgiveness. Understanding didn't undo damage. He'd had reasons for his cruelty, yes. Fear, cowardice, a twisted attempt at protection. But reasons weren't justification. He could have warned her, could have been honest, could have chosen courage over convenience. Instead, he'd destroyed her to save himself, the trouble of facing Penelope's wrath. And her father had paid with his life. She had paid with 12 years of exile and loneliness. Those debts couldn't be settled with explanations offered on a deathbed. Yet she couldn't hate him anymore either. He wasn't the monster she'd imagined for 12 years, just a weak man who'd made cruel choices and spent 12 years drowning in their consequences. Somehow, that was sadder than hatred, more painful than rage. A sound in the corridor drew her attention. Voices, one she recognized as Mrs. Brennan's, another that sent ice through her veins. Amy opened her door to find a woman standing in the hallway, wrapped in black mourning silk. She was perhaps 45, still beautiful in a hard, brittle way. Her dark hair was elegantly dressed, her face artfully painted, but her eyes held the cold calculation of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Lady Penelope Hartwick. Miss Morris. Penelope's voice was honey over steel. Come to gloat over the dying? You're supposed to be dead, Amy said. The words came out flat, shocked. Alexander told you that? Penelope's laugh was bitter. How like him. Wishful thinking, perhaps. I've been in Bath these past months, taking the waters, but I returned when I heard he'd sent for you. Understanding crystallized. You wanted to see if I'd come, if he still had that power over me. And here you are. Penelope's smile was poisonous. 12 years later, still dancing to his tune. I know what you did, Amy said quietly. The door, the witnesses, the orchestrated humiliation. Penelope's pretense dropped like a shed cloak. I protected what was mine. He was never yours. You rejected him first, married another man for his title. And he should have waited. Penelope's voice turned vicious. Devoted himself to me. Proved his love was stronger than his wounded pride. Amy stepped closer, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. You wanted him bound but kept him starving. That's not love, Lady Penelope. That's possession. You wanted to own him without giving anything of yourself. And what would you know of love? Penelope's lip curled. You, with your desperate confession in a study, throwing yourself at a man so far above your station. I know, Amy said quietly, that love is offering something freely without demanding control. I know it's wanting someone's happiness, even if it doesn't include you. I know it's the opposite of everything you ever gave him. You didn't love Alexander. You loved having power over him. There's a difference. Penelope's face went white, then red. He's dying anyway. Whatever you came to say, whatever closure you sought, you're too late. Amy met her eyes steadily. So are you. She closed the door on Penelope's stricken face and returned to her window, her hands shaking but her heart strangely light. Some truths, spoken aloud, had power to heal. By morning, Alexander had worsened dramatically. Amy found him barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mrs. Brennan shook her head grimly. It won't be long now, miss. Amy sat beside him through the day, not out of love that had died 12 years ago, but as witness. No one should die alone, and whatever his sins, Alexander deserved someone to mark his passing. He surfaced briefly as twilight gathered, his grey eyes finding her face with desperate clarity. Thank you for coming, he whispered. Not for my sake, I know I don't deserve your mercy, but for yours. You needed to see that the monster who hurt you was just a frightened man. I won't lie and say I forgive you, Amy replied. I don't ask for forgiveness, just understanding. I understand you were broken. I understand fear made you cruel. But understanding isn't absolution, Alexander. You have to forgive yourself. I can't do it for you. His hand reached for hers weakly. After a moment's hesitation, she took its simple human connection, one person witnessing another's departure from the world. I loved you, you know, Alexander murmured. I realized it too late. I hope. Someone loves you better someday. I hope you find peace, Amy said quietly. Wherever you're going. 3 more breaths, each one harder than the last. The 4th never came. She sat for several minutes, his hand still in hers, feeling the warmth slowly leave his fingers. Then she arranged his hands carefully on his chest and went to summon Mrs. Brennan. The rituals followed: physician, undertaker, notifications to the heir. The funeral would be in 3 days. Will you stay, Mrs. Brennan asked. No, he's gone. The rest is formality. Mrs. Brennan brought her a package Alexander had left. Inside, a wooden toy horse, worn smooth by years of handling, and a letter establishing £300 annually for Milbrook School in perpetuity. For one of your students, the note read, perhaps a child can learn the lesson I never did. The flaw was always in me, never in you. Amy departed that afternoon. The coach carried her north again, not fleeing this time, but choosing to leave. She watched Greyhaven Hall recede with no regret, only a curious lightness, like setting down a burden carried too long. She arrived in Milbrook at twilight. Students waited at the schoolhouse gate. Lucy threw herself at Amy's skirts. You came back? Of course I came back, I promised. Amy gave Lucy the wooden horse. This is for you. A reminder that even small things have value when treated with care. Mrs. Fletcher's embrace was warm. Welcome home, dear. It's good to be home. So good to be home. That night, in her small room under the eaves, Amy burned Alexander's letter, keeping only the bank draft for her school. She watched his words disappear to ash and felt, finally, free. She wasn't sorry she'd loved him. The ability to love was never the weakness, the inability to accept love. That was the true tragedy. Tomorrow she would teach. Tomorrow her life would continue, rich in purpose and love given and received. Not the life she'd planned at 20, but a good life nonetheless, maybe even better for having been built from ruins rather than inherited whole. Sometimes, she thought as sleep took her, the greatest revenge isn't their suffering, but your flourishing. She'd survived Alexander Ashford. More than survived, she'd built a life worth living from the rubble he'd left behind. And that was the only victory that truly mattered.